There is a moment in the life of every empath when exhaustion becomes unbearable. Not the kind of tiredness that sleep can fix, but the deep fatigue that lives in the bones. The kind that whispers, I cannot keep abandoning myself like this. For years, perhaps decades, you were praised for your sensitivity. You were the understanding one, the patient one, the strong one. You felt what others felt before they spoke it. You carried tension in your chest that did not belong to you. You absorbed anger, sadness, fear, and called it love. But what if that sensitivity was not simply a gift? What if it was once a survival strategy? Many empaths learned early in life that attunement kept them safe. When the room shifted, you noticed. When a caregiver, as mood changed, you adapted. You became skilled at reading microexpressions, tone, silence, not because you were mystical, but because your nervous system needed to predict danger. Hyperempathy was intelligence. It was protection. But protection has a cost. When a child learns that connection requires self-suppression, authenticity becomes dangerous. Saying no feels like abandonment. Expressing anger feels like betrayal. Having needs feels selfish. So the empath becomes who others require. And this is where the slow erosion begins. You give, you soothe. You stay longer than you should. You explain away disrespect. You tolerate what wounds you, not because you are weak, but because your body still believes that harmony equals safety. Until one day it does. Burnout is not failure. Burnout is the nervous system saying, I cannot survive like this anymore. Anxiety rises, resentment leaks through, fatigue deepens, relationships feel heavy, and the empath begins to wonder what is wrong with them. Nothing is wrong with you. What is happening is a reckoning. The comeback of the empath does not look loud. It does not begin with revenge or dramatic exits or declarations of superiority. It begins quietly with a single terrifying shift. You stop abandoning yourself. You notice the tightness in your chest when someone crosses a boundary, and instead of dismissing it, you honor it. You feel the anger, and instead of shaming it, you listen. You recognize that empathy without self-empathy is self-erasure. This is the turning point. The biggest comeback of your life begins when your compassion includes you. For perhaps the first time, you allow yourself to disappoint others. You allow someone to misunderstand you. You allow the discomfort of saying no without over-explaining. Your nervous system shakes. It feels unsafe. Old fears surface. They will leave. I will be alone. But something remarkable happens. You survive. And in surviving, your body learns a new truth. Authenticity does not equal abandonment. The empath who once dissolved into others begins to stand, not aggressively, not defensively, but steadily. There is less performance, less overfunctioning, less rescuing. You begin to ask new questions. Is this relationship reciprocal? Is this conversation respectful? Is my body relaxed or bracing? These questions change everything, because the comeback is not about becoming harder. It is about becoming whole. Empathy remains, but it is no longer compulsive. You feel others, but you are not responsible for regulating them. You love deeply, but you do not negotiate your dignity. You help, but not at the expense of your health. For many empaths, the old identity was built on being needed. The new identity is built on being real. And here's the paradox. When you stop chasing approval, your presence becomes more powerful. When you stop overgiving, your energy becomes magnetic. When you stop shrinking, your voice carries weight. Not because you changed who you are, but because you stopped hiding. The biggest comeback of your life is not external success. It is internal alignment. It is waking up without resentment. It is speaking without fear. It is resting without guilt. It is loving without self-betrayal. Some people will not like the new you. They preferred the version that overextended, overexplained, overforgave. They may call you distant, cold, changed. You have changed. You are no longer surviving childhood patterns. You are living consciously. The empath, as great as power, was never their ability to feel others. It was their capacity for depth. And when that depth is finally directed inward, healing accelerates. You begin to reparent yourself. You begin to validate your own experience. You begin to create relationships based on choice, not fear. And from this place, your energy returns. Creativity returns. Clarity returns. Joy returns. Because energy that was once spent managing others is now invested in building your life. This is the comeback. It is not dramatic. It is embodied. It is the quiet confidence of someone who knows their nervous system matters. It is the calm strength of someone who can sit with discomfort without collapsing. It is the freedom of someone who no longer confuses self-sacrifice with love. If you feel the exhaustion right now, if you feel the pull to withdraw, if something inside you is whispering that you cannot continue the old way, listen to it. That whisper is not weakness, it is wisdom. The empath is not breaking down, the empath is breaking free. And this time you are not coming back to who you were. You are coming back to who you have always been, before you learned that love required losing yourself. That is the greatest comeback of all the empath, as burnout is not weakness. It is the nervous system demanding truth. There comes a point in the empath, as life, when the exhaustion can no longer be disguised as generosity. It is no longer framed as dedication, patience, or loyalty. It becomes something heavier, something that sits in the chest and refuses to move. Not because the empath is incapable, but because the body has reached its limit. Burnout in the empath is rarely about doing too much work. It is about carrying too much emotional weight that was never theirs to hold. From early on, many empaths learned to read the emotional climate of a room before they learned to read their own internal signals. They became attuned to tension, conflict, disappointment, and subtle rejection. Their nervous system developed around scanning for danger and soothing it before it escalated. This hyperattunement was not a personality trait. It was adaptation. It was intelligence shaped by environment. If harmony meant safety, then maintaining harmony became essential. If a caregiver as mood determined connection, then monitoring that mood became survival. Over time, this adaptation solidified into identity. The empath became the listener, the fixer, the mediator, the stable one, the one who could handle it, the one who understood. But beneath that competence, the nervous system remained in a chronic state of activation, always alert, always prepared, always managing. Burnout is what happens when the body can no longer sustain the vigilance. The nervous system was never designed to live in continuous emotional responsibility. It was designed for cycles of activation and rest, for engagement and withdrawal, for connection that feels mutual. When an empath consistently overrides their own signals in order to maintain relationships, the body keeps the score. Fatigue deepens. Irritability appears without clear cause. Anxiety rises in situations that once felt manageable. There may be headaches, muscle tension, digestive issues, insomnia. The empath often interprets this as personal failure. They tell themselves they are becoming too sensitive, too emotional, too overwhelmed. But the body is not failing. The body is speaking. Burnout is not weakness. It is protest. It is the nervous system saying that self-abandonment has reached an unsustainable level. Every time the empath said yes while meaning no, every time they dismissed their discomfort to avoid conflict, every time they absorbed someone else, anger without expressing their own, each of those moments required physiological suppression. Suppression is expensive. When feelings are not expressed, they do not disappear. They settle into the tissues. They shape posture, breathing patterns, tone of voice. The empath may not consciously register resentment, but the body does. The empath may rationalize another person's behavior, but the nervous system still experiences threat when boundaries are crossed. Truth in this context is not philosophical. It is biological. The truth is that the empath has needs. The truth is that chronic self-sacrifice creates imbalance. The truth is that relationships built on one-sided emotional labor exhaust the organism. And the nervous system, when ignored for too long, will amplify its signals. Burnout forces awareness. It removes the illusion that endless giving is sustainable. It strips away the identity of being the strong one. It reveals the cost of being indispensable. The empath, who once took pride in their capacity to endure, begins to feel the consequences of that endurance. There is often shame here, a belief that others can handle more, that others are stronger. But the empath system has simply been overloaded for longer. What looks like sudden collapse is usually the accumulation of years of unacknowledged strain. When the nervous system demands truth, it is asking for alignment. It is asking for actions that match internal experience. It is asking for boundaries where there has been compliance. It is asking for rest where there has been overextension. This moment can feel destabilizing, because if the empath stops overfunctioning, relationships may shift, some connections may weaken. Some people may react with confusion or frustration. The empath may fear being perceived as selfish. Yet what is being requested is not selfishness. It is integrity. To honor burnout is to begin listening inward instead of outward. To notice the tightening in the stomach during certain conversations. To recognize when fatigue follows specific interactions. To acknowledge that empathy without reciprocity depletes vitality. As truth is allowed, energy slowly reorganizes. The empath begins to differentiate between compassion and responsibility, between understanding someone and fixing them, between supporting and absorbing. This differentiation calms the nervous system because it reduces unnecessary load. Burnout then becomes transition rather than breakdown. The system that once survived by constant vigilance learns that safety can also come from boundaries, that connection does not require self-erasure, that authenticity, though uncomfortable at first, reduces long-term stress. When the empath stops overriding their signals, the body responds, sleep improves, breathing deepens. There's less internal friction. Not because life becomes easy, but because internal conflict decreases. The comeback of the empath begins here, not in dramatic change, but in subtle honesty, in saying no without elaborate justification, in pausing before agreeing, in allowing disappointment to exist without rushing to fix it. Burnout was never evidence of fragility. It was evidence of endurance pushed too far. And the nervous system, in demanding truth, is not attacking the empath. It is protecting them. It is guiding them back to balance, back to self-recognition, back to a form of empathy that includes the self as worthy of care. When truth is honored, burnout transforms from collapse into awakening. A child does not choose to become hyper-aware. A child becomes hyper-aware when the environment requires it, when safety depends on righting subtle emotional shifts, when connection depends on compliance, when love feels unpredictable. The nervous system adapts with remarkable intelligence. What later gets labeled as hyper-empathy often began as vigilance. In many early environments, emotional consistency was absent. A caregiver's mood could change without warning. Affection might be warm one moment and distant the next. Conflict might simmer beneath silence. For a child whose survival depends entirely on attachment, unpredictability is not a minor inconvenience. It is a threat. The child's nervous system responds by sharpening perception. Tone of voice becomes data. Footsteps in the hallway carry meaning. Facial expressions are scanned for microsignals. The child learns to anticipate reactions before they occur. Not because they are unusually gifted, but because anticipation reduces risk. This is the beginning of hyper-empathy. It is not mystical sensitivity. It is strategic attunement. The child thinks, often unconsciously, that if they can sense the emotional climate quickly enough, they can adjust themselves to maintain connection. If anger is coming, they soften. If sadness appears, they comfort. If tension rises, they become agreeable. The body records this as safety. Over time, the child internalizes a powerful equation. Other people's emotions determine security. Their own emotions become secondary. Expressing anger may have led to withdrawal. Expressing sadness may have been dismissed. Expressing needs may have been met with irritation. So the child redirects attention outward. Hyper-empathy becomes an organizing principle. Instead of asking, "What do I feel?" the question becomes, "What does everyone else feel?" Instead of developing internal boundaries, the child develops external sensitivity. This is adaptive in the short term. It increases the likelihood of staying connected in unstable conditions. But adaptation has consequences. The child who constantly monitors others often disconnects from themselves, not because they lack depth, but because self-attunement was not rewarded. When authenticity threatens attachment, authenticity is suppressed. The nervous system prioritizes belonging over self-expression. Years later, this adaptation looks like extraordinary compassion. The adult empath can walk into a room and immediately sense tension. They intuit unspoken pain. They know when someone is distressed before words are spoken. Others admire this ability. They call it kindness, intuition, emotional intelligence. Few recognize the origin. Hyper-empathy often carries a residue of fear. Beneath this skill is the old belief that if others are not regulated, safety is at risk. The adult empath may feel responsible for smoothing conflict, easing discomfort, preventing disappointment. Not because they consciously choose to, but because their body equates harmony with survival. Relationships can become unbalanced. The empath may gravitate toward people who are emotionally volatile or wounded, because that dynamic feels familiar. They may overextend themselves in order to stabilize others. They may struggle to tolerate disapproval, even when they have done nothing wrong. The survival strategy continues long after the original environment has changed. What once protected now exhausts. Hyperempathy requires constant outward focus. It requires subtle muscular tension, shallow breathing, readiness to respond. The nervous system remains slightly activated, scanning for shifts. Over time, this chronic activation leads to fatigue, anxiety, or resentment. The empath may not understand why they feel depleted around certain people. They only know that being around emotional intensity feels both familiar and draining. There is often confusion here. The empath believes their value lies in their ability to care deeply. Letting go of hyper-responsibility feels dangerous. It feels like abandoning the very skill that once ensured love. Yet healing begins with recognizing that the adaptation was context-specific. As a child, hyper-empathy was intelligent. It maximized safety within limited options. As an adult, the same pattern may no longer be necessary. The nervous system simply has not updated its assumptions. It still reacts as if every emotional disturbance must be managed. When awareness grows, space opens. The empath begins to notice the other people as emotions are not emergencies. They begin to differentiate between empathy and enmeshment. They realize that feeling another as pain does not require absorbing it. This shift can feel unsettling at first. The body may interpret it as risk. Old fears of rejection surface. But with repeated experience, the nervous system learns something new. Connection can survive honesty. Disagreement does not automatically equal abandonment. Another person's discomfort does not mean danger. This is not about losing empathy. It is about freeing it from compulsion. When hyperempathy relaxes into grounded compassion, the empath regains access to themselves. They begin to sense their own hunger, fatigue, frustration, desire. They learn that self-attunement does not threaten love. It strengthens it. Childhood adaptation shaped the nervous system with precision. It created a capacity for depth, insight, and care. That capacity is not the problem. The problem arises when the strategy becomes rigid and unquestioned. To honor the origin of hyperempathy is to approach it with respect rather than shame. It kept the child connected. It preserved belonging. It demonstrated resilience. Now the task is integration. The adult empath can retain sensitivity while releasing hypervigilance. They can remain compassionate without sacrificing boundaries. They can allow others to own their emotional processes. What began as survival can evolve into conscious choice. And when empathy is no longer driven by fear, it becomes something far more powerful. It becomes a gift freely offered, rather than a reflex born of necessity. That exhaustion rarely begins with doing too much. It begins with betraying oneself in small, almost invisible ways. A quiet yes when the body is saying no. A smile that replaces honest frustration. Agreement offered to avoid tension. Over time, these moments accumulate, and what looks like fatigue is often the weight of self-abandonment. Self-abandonment is subtle. It does not announce itself loudly. It disguises itself as kindness, flexibility, maturity. The person who practices it is often praised for being easygoing, dependable, generous. They become the one others rely on, the one who does not complain, the one who adapts. But adaptation without authenticity drains vitality. When someone consistently overrides their own needs to preserve connection, the nervous system pays the price. Each time an internal signal is ignored, the body registers incongruence. The heart may race slightly, the jaw may tighten, the breath may shorten. These are not dramatic reactions, but they are cumulative. Exhaustion grows not from effort alone, but from internal conflict. Saying yes while meaning no creates friction. Offering comfort while feeling depleted creates strain. Listening patiently while resentment simmers creates tension beneath the surface. The individual may not consciously label this as self-betrayal, yet the body recognizes it. Resentment is often misunderstood as anger toward others. In truth, resentment frequently points inward. It arises when a person repeatedly participates in dynamics that violate their limits. The anger that seems directed outward is often grief for the self that was not protected. Many people who struggle with chronic exhaustion have a long history of prioritizing harmony over honesty. As children, they may have learned that expressing needs led to rejection or conflict. So they learn to minimize themselves. That strategy may have preserved attachment in the past, but in adulthood it becomes corrosive. When someone abandons themselves to maintain a relationship, they create imbalance. They give more than they receive. They listen more than they speak. They accommodate more than they assert. Over time, this imbalance produces depletion. The body cannot sustain one-sided emotional labor indefinitely. Self-abandonment also fragments identity. When preferences are constantly suppressed, clarity diminishes. The person may struggle to answer simple questions about what they want. They may feel disconnected from desire. Life begins to feel heavy, not because it lacks opportunity, but because it lacks alignment. Resentment builds quietly in these spaces. It may surface as irritability over minor issues. It may appear as sudden withdrawal. It may show up as criticism toward those who seem demanding. Yet, beneath these reactions lies a deeper truth. The individual has not been honoring their own boundaries. Boundaries are not walls against others. They are commitments to the self. When boundaries are absent or inconsistent, the nervous system remains on alert. It anticipates intrusion. It braces for overextension. This chronic vigilance contributes to fatigue. Exhaustion is often the body's attempt to force re-evaluation. When energy decreases, it becomes harder to continue pleasing. When motivation fades, it becomes more difficult to overfunction. Burnout interrupts the pattern of self-sacrifice. It exposes the unsustainability of constant self-neglect. There can be shame in recognizing this. Admitting self-abandonment challenges the identity of being generous or strong. It may feel uncomfortable to acknowledge that resentment has been growing beneath politeness. Yet awareness is not condemnation. It is the beginning of responsibility. Responsibility here does not mean blame. It means reclaiming agency. Instead of asking why others take too much, the question shifts to why one continues to give beyond capacity. Instead of focusing solely on external demands, attention turns inward toward internal permission. Permission to rest without guilt. Permission to decline without elaborate explanation. Permission to express disappointment without fearing abandonment. As these permissions are practiced, exhaustion begins to ease, not instantly, but gradually. Energy returns when alignment increases. Resentment softens when self-protection strengthens. It is important to understand that resentment is not evidence of cruelty. It is a signal. It indicates that a boundary has been crossed, often by the self before anyone else. When someone agrees to what they do not want, they participate in their own depletion. Reversing self-abandonment requires tolerance for discomfort. Saying no may trigger anxiety. Setting limits may provoke pushback. Choosing authenticity over approval may create temporary instability in relationships. Yet long-term vitality depends on this shift. When a person honors their internal signals, trust develops within. The nervous system relaxes because it no longer has to escalate symptoms to be heard. Headaches lessen. Sleep improves. Emotional reactivity decreases. These changes are not magical. They reflect reduced internal contradiction. Resentment fades when the self feels protected. Exhaustion diminishes when effort aligns with values. Self-abandonment is hidden because it often looks virtuous. It is rewarded socially. It is praised in workplaces and families. But beneath that praise can lie chronic depletion. Choosing differently is not selfishness. It is integration. When someone stands by themselves consistently, relationships become clearer. Some dynamics may fall away, others may deepen. What remains is grounded in mutual respect rather than silent sacrifice. Exhaustion then transforms from a mysterious burden into a meaningful message. It reveals where authenticity has been compromised. It highlights where boundaries require strengthening. Resentment becomes less frequent because the self is no longer neglected. And in that shift, energy begins to flow back toward creativity, presence, and genuine connection. Not because life demands less, but because the individual demands honesty from themselves. Though for many sensitive and empathic people, the word boundary carries tension. It feels sharp, almost aggressive. It can stir guilt before it is even spoken. Somewhere along the way, the nervous system learned that saying no risks disconnection, that asserting limits might threaten love, that protecting oneself could be mistaken for pushing others away. But a boundary is not an act of rejection. It is an act of remembering oneself. When a person has spent years prioritizing harmony over honesty, boundaries feel unfamiliar. The habit has been accommodation. The reflex has been explanation. The impulse has been a smooth discomfort quickly, so that no one feels unsettled. In that pattern, the self slowly becomes secondary. Self-reclamation begins when that pattern is questioned. A boundary does not declare that others are unworthy. It declares that the self is worthy. It does not say, "You are too much." It says, "This is what I can hold without losing myself." There is a profound difference between exclusion and definition. Rejection pushes away. A boundary clarifies where one person ends and another begins. Without boundaries, identity becomes porous. The moods, expectations, and desires of others blend into one as internal landscape. Decisions are made based on anticipated reactions rather than authentic preference. Over time, this blurring produces confusion and fatigue. The person may not know why they feel resentful. They may only sense that something is off. What is off is the absence of self-protection. Boundaries are the nervous system's way of restoring coherence. When a limit is set, the body experiences alignment between inner truth and outer action. That alignment reduces stress. The breath deepens. Muscles soften. There is less internal argument. Yet the first attempts at boundary setting can feel destabilizing. Old fears arise. What if they leave? What if they become angry? What if I am misunderstood? These fears often originate in early attachment experiences where love felt conditional. The child learned that compliance maintained connection. As an adult, the same fear can surface even in relatively safe relationships. Self-reclamation asks for courage, not dramatic confrontation, but steady honesty. It may begin with small moments, declining an invitation without inventing an excuse, naming a need for space, expressing discomfort when a line is crossed. Each time a boundary is honored, the nervous system updates its expectations. It learns that authenticity does not automatically equal abandonment. It learns that conflict can be tolerated. It learns that connection built on mutual respect feels different from connection built on self-erasure. Some people will resist these changes. They may interpret a boundary as withdrawal. They may accuse the person of becoming distant or selfish. This reaction often reflects their own discomfort with limits. If a dynamic relied on one person overextending, recalibration will feel disruptive. But disruption is not destruction. In fact, boundaries often strengthen healthy relationships. They create clarity. They prevent silent resentment from accumulating. They allow both people to understand what is sustainable. When limits are communicated respectfully, trust can deepen. Self-reclamation is not about building walls. Walls isolate. Boundaries differentiate. A wall says, no one gets close. A boundary says, closeness is welcome within what feels safe and reciprocal. For individuals who have long defined themselves by availability, this shift can challenge identity. Who am I if I am not always the helper? Who am I if I disappoint someone? These questions point toward growth. They invite exploration beyond the role of caretaker or mediator. As boundaries solidify, energy returns. Time and emotional capacity are no longer consumed by overextension. There is space for creativity, rest, and genuine choice. The body no longer braces for intrusion because it trusts that limits will be upheld. Resentment decreases as well. When a person participates in their own protection, anger has less reason to build. Frustration may still arise, but it is addressed sooner. Communication becomes more direct. Relationships become less performative. It is important to recognize that boundaries are not demands for others to change. They are commitments to one's own behavior. If someone continues to act in ways that feel harmful, the boundary may involve stepping back, not as punishment, but as preservation. This distinction matters. Rejection is fueled by judgment. Self-reclamation is guided by self-respect. When someone says, "This does not work for me," they are not declaring the other person wrong. They are acknowledging their own limits. When they choose distance from dynamics that feel depleting, they are not abandoning love. They are choosing sustainability. Over time, the nervous system begins to associate boundaries with safety rather than threat. The anxiety that once accompanied limit setting diminishes. Confidence grows quietly. There is less need to justify, defend, or over-explain. Self-reclamation becomes embodied. The voice steadies. The posture shifts. Decisions feel clear. Relationships that remain are those capable of honoring mutual autonomy. Boundaries do not shrink the heart. They protect it. They ensure that compassion flows from choice rather than compulsion. They allow empathy to exist without self-sacrifice. They transform connection from obligation into authenticity. And in that transformation, the individual no longer feels lost within others. For years, empathy may have flowed outward like a river with no return. Attention moved automatically toward others, their moods, their wounds, their disappointments, their needs. The capacity to sense subtle shifts became refined, almost instinctive. Yet somewhere in that constant outward movement, the self grew faint. The comeback does not begin with changing the world around you. It begins with changing the direction of your compassion. Turning empathy inward can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. If your nervous system learned early that safety depended on attuning to others, then shifting focus toward yourself may trigger guilt or anxiety. You may hear an internal voice suggesting that self-attention is selfish, that your role is to hold space, not to take it. But empathy that excludes the self is incomplete. When you offer understanding to everyone except yourself, you create imbalance. You validate others, pain while dismissing your own. You soothe others, fears while minimizing your own exhaustion. This pattern appears generous on the surface, yet internally it generates depletion. The body keeps track of this imbalance. Each time you override your fatigue to remain available. Each time you silence frustration to avoid conflict. Each time you rationalize someone else as behavior while invalidating your own discomfort. These moments accumulate. They create a quiet fracture between what you feel and how you act. The comeback begins when you notice that fracture. It begins when you pause long enough to ask, what am I feeling right now? Not what are they feeling? Not what should I feel? But what is true in my body in this moment? Perhaps there is tightness in the chest. Perhaps there is heaviness behind the eyes. Perhaps there is anger that has not been acknowledged. Turning empathy inward means meeting these sensations with the same patience you offer others. Instead of judging yourself for being overwhelmed, you become curious. Instead of criticizing yourself for being sensitive, you become compassionate. You recognize that your reactions are not character flaws. They are signals. Self-empathy transforms those signals from enemies into guides. When sadness arises, you do not immediately distract yourself by tending to someone else. You sit with it. You ask what it needs. When resentment surfaces, you do not shame it away. You explore the boundary that may have been crossed. When exhaustion settles in, you treat it as information rather than weakness. This shift changes everything. The nervous system, long accustomed to being ignored, begins to feel heard. Regulation improves not because life becomes easier, but because internal conflict decreases. There is less suppression, less performance, less pretending. Turning empathy inward also clarifies responsibility. You begin to distinguish between what belongs to you and what does not. You may still feel others' emotions deeply, but you no longer assume ownership of them. You recognize that understanding someone does not require rescuing them. This recognition restores energy. For many, the identity of being the strong one or the reliable one has been central. Letting go of constant outward focus can feel like losing purpose. Yet in reality, you are not losing purpose. You are expanding it to include yourself. The comeback is not about becoming harder or less caring. It is about integrating care. It is about ensuring that the compassion you extend is sustainable. As you practice inward empathy, boundaries become clearer. You sense earlier when something feels misaligned. You speak sooner. You withdraw when necessary without dramatizing the decision. There is less buildup of silent resentment because your needs are acknowledged before they become urgent. Self-trust grows in this process. You learn that your emotions carry wisdom. That discomfort signals misalignment. That joy signals congruence. Instead of outsourcing validation, you cultivate it internally. You become less dependent on external reassurance because you are no longer abandoning your own experience. This does not eliminate fear. There may still be moments of doubt when you choose yourself. There may be relationships that shift when you stop overextending. But the stability you gain internally outweighs the temporary discomfort externally. The comeback is subtle at first. You feel slightly more rested because you said no when you meant no. You feel lighter because you expressed truth instead of swallowing it. You feel calmer because you allowed yourself to disengage from dynamics that were not yours to manage. Over time, these small acts accumulate. They rebuild identity from the inside out. Empathy turned inward becomes self-respect. It becomes discernment. It becomes the foundation for relationships based on mutual care rather than imbalance. You discover that your depth was never the problem. The problem was directing that depth exclusively outward. When you include yourself in your circle of compassion, you stop fragmenting. You become whole. The comeback then is not a dramatic reinvention. It is a return to the parts of you that were sidelined, a return to honoring your own signals, a return to living in alignment with your internal truth. When empathy flows both ways, outward and inward, it nourishes rather than depletes. And from that nourishment, strength quietly re-emerges. For much of life, approval can feel like oxygen, a nod of validation, a compliment, a sign that you are accepted. Especially for those who learned early that love was conditional, approval becomes more than pleasant feedback. It becomes proof of safety. When connection once depended on pleasing others, the nervous system wired itself around anticipation. What do they need? What will keep them calm? What will prevent rejection? This pattern can continue into adulthood, shaping choices in relationships, careers, even personal identity. The pursuit of approval is rarely shallow. It is protective. Yet living for approval creates instability. Approval is unpredictable. It shifts with mood, culture, expectation. If your sense of worth depends on external validation, your internal state will fluctuate with every reaction around you. Praise lifts you briefly. Criticism destabilizes you deeply. Authenticity offers a different ground. Authenticity begins with recognizing what is true inside, independent of applause. It means acknowledging preferences that may not impress anyone. It means expressing feelings that may not be universally welcomed. It means allowing your voice to carry its natural tone rather than adjusting it for comfort. This shift can feel threatening at first. If approval once ensured belonging, then choosing authenticity may trigger old fears. The body may tense when you speak honestly. Anxiety may surface when you disagree. There may be an impulse to soften your truth so it is more palatable. But each time you override your authenticity to secure approval, you create internal division. One part of you performs, another part feels unseen. Over time, this division erodes vitality. You may succeed outwardly while feeling hollow inwardly. Power rooted in approval is fragile. Power rooted in authenticity is steady. When you speak from genuine experience, your nervous system aligns. Breath and voice synchronize. Posture steadies. There's less mental calculation about how you are being perceived. Energy that once went into impression management becomes available for presence. Authenticity does not guarantee universal acceptance. In fact, It often reveals incompatibilities. Some people may prefer the version of you that adapted to their expectations. When you stop bending, they may feel discomfort. That discomfort does not mean you are wrong. It means the dynamic is changing. Approval seeks harmony at any cost. Authenticity seeks integrity. Integrity does not require conflict, but it does not avoid it at the expense of truth. When you stand in your values, even quietly, you communicate self-respect. Self-respect alters how others relate to you. People sense when you're not negotiating your identity. They may not always agree, but they recognize clarity. Boundaries become clearer. Expectations become more realistic. Relationships that continue are based on mutual recognition rather than silent compromise. The nervous system responds positively to this congruence. Chronic tension decreases because you are no longer monitoring every word for acceptance. Emotional swings lessen because criticism no longer dismantles your core. Feedback becomes information rather than verdict. Authenticity also deepens connection. When you reveal what you genuinely think and feel, you invite others to do the same. Conversations become less performative. There is space for disagreement without collapse. Intimacy grows not from perfection, but for honesty. Power, in this sense, is not dominance. It is stability. It is the ability to remain grounded when others approve, and when they do not. It is the capacity to tolerate misunderstanding without abandoning yourself. It is the confidence that comes from knowing you are aligned internally. For many, this transition involves grief. Letting go of approval as a primary goal may mean releasing certain roles. The reliable peacemaker, the agreeable colleague, the endlessly accommodating partner. These identities once secured belonging. Now they may feel constraining. As authenticity strengthens, choices change. You may pursue work that reflects your values rather than impresses others. You may choose relationships that honor reciprocity rather than status. You may express limits without elaborate justification. There will still be moments of doubt. The old pattern of seeking reassurance does not disappear overnight. But with practice, you learn to pause before adjusting yourself for comfort. You ask whether the adjustment serves truth or fear. When decisions are made from authenticity, even difficult outcomes carry less regret. You may face disagreement, but you do not face yourself with betrayal. That internal peace is a form of power. Approval can enhance life, but it cannot anchor it. Authenticity anchors. It allows you to move through changing environments without losing orientation. It reduces the need for constant validation. It creates resilience because your foundation is internal rather than external. Over time, others respond differently. Some step closer, appreciating the clarity. Some step away, uncomfortable with the shift. What remains is alignment. Authenticity does not promise comfort. It promises coherence, and coherence generates a quiet authority that approval alone can never sustain. They feel present within themselves.